One of Britain's most beloved voices suddenly went silent. No warning, no explanation, just gone. For someone who'd been everywhere for 60 years, the absence felt wrong. And when the truth finally came out, it was worse than anyone imagined. Cliff Richard wasn't just another pop star who faded away. This was different. This was a man who'd sold over 250 million records worldwide, who charted hits in 6 consecutive decades, who was as much a part of British culture as tea in the royal family. He was the Peter Pan of pop, the guy who never seemed to age, never seemed to slow down. And then, in 2014, he vanished. Not a gradual retirement, not a planned break. He was just erased from public life almost overnight. The timing was suspicious. 1 month, he's planning tours, recording albums, doing his usual television appearances. The next, complete radio silence. Industry insiders started whispering something had gone terribly wrong, but what could possibly drive someone with that kind of staying power into hiding? The answer would expose a system that failed him in the most public, humiliating way possible. August 14, 2014. That's the date everything changed. Cliff Richard was at his home in Portugal, enjoying what should have been a peaceful vacation. Instead, he got a phone call that would shatter his world. His residence back in Berkshire was being raided by South Yorkshire police. An allegation had surfaced, something supposedly from decades earlier, back in 1985. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The BBC knew about the raid before it happened. They'd been tipped off. And they didn't just report on it afterward like normal news outlets would. They sent a helicopter. They broadcast the whole thing live. Cameras hovering over his home, commentators speculating in real time, police officers searching his private residence while millions watched on television. This wasn't journalism. This was a public execution before any investigation had even begun. Think about that for a second. Imagine finding out your home is being raided. Not from the police, not from your lawyer, but from friends calling to say they're watching it happen on live TV. The presumption of innocence, that cornerstone of justice everyone talks about, gone in an instant. Cliff hadn't been interviewed, he hadn't been charged with anything, yet there was his home, his private sanctuary, being broadcast to the world with the clear implication that he'd done something terrible. The immediate impact was devastating. According to people close to him, Cliff's body basically started shutting down from the shock. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Friends described him as barely recognizable, the usually energetic performer suddenly frail and diminished. This wasn't just emotional distress, this was physical collapse. And the worst part? The investigation was only beginning. 22 months. That's how long Cliff Richard lived in limbo, not knowing if charges would be filed, unable to defend himself publicly without potentially harming the investigation, watching his reputation disintegrate day by day. For nearly 2 years, his life was on hold, while prosecutors examined an allegation that would eventually be deemed baseless. But you can't just pause your life for 2 years without consequences. The financial hit was staggering. Legal representation at this level doesn't come cheap. Cliff spent over £3 million defending himself. $3 million, and that's just the lawyers. There were canceled album releases, tours that never happened, television appearances that got pulled, endorsement deals that evaporated. Every day the investigation continued was another day of lost income and mounting legal bills. For someone in their mid-70s, this wasn't just a career setback. This was potentially losing the security you'd built over 60 decades of work. But here's what most people don't understand about these situations. Even when you're completely innocent, even when you know you've done nothing wrong, the accusation itself becomes the story. The damage happens immediately, in that first broadcast, in those first headlines. Everything after is just trying to undo what's already been done. And sometimes you can never fully repair it. June 2016, finally, after nearly 2 years of investigation, the Crown Prosecution Service made their announcement. Insufficient evidence. No charges would be filed. Cliff Richard was, legally speaking, in the clear. But if you think that's where the story ends, you haven't been paying attention. Being cleared isn't the same as being vindicated. The court of public opinion doesn't work the same way as actual courts. Some people would always remember the raid, the helicopter, the speculation. The exoneration, that got much less attention. Cliff wasn't about to just accept that and move on. He'd been publicly humiliated by institutions he'd trusted. The BBC, a broadcaster he'd worked with for decades, had turned his nightmare into entertainment. South Yorkshire police had allowed that to happen. So he did something most people in his position couldn't afford to do. He sued them both. The legal battle dragged on for another 2 years. 2 more years of reliving the trauma of depositions and testimony and cross-examinations. 2 more years of his life consumed by something that should never have happened in the first place. But in July 2018, he finally got his day in court. The judge's ruling was unequivocal. The BBC had violated his privacy rights in a serious and sensationalist manner. He was awarded damages and approximately £2 million toward his legal costs. South Yorkshire police settled separately for another $400,000.
But here's the thing about legal victories. They don't give you back time. And for someone in their late 70s, time is the most precious commodity there is. Cliff had lost 4 years. 4 years he could have been recording, touring, performing for the fans who supported him for 6 decades. 4 years of his life consumed by something that should have been handled with basic decency and discretion. The money couldn't fix that. The ruling couldn't undo it. The toll on his health during those years remains largely hidden from public view. Court documents acknowledged evidence of health impacts from the stress, but the full extent only his closest circle truly witnessed. The physical symptoms, the psychological trauma, the moments of despair that contradicted everything about his usually positive public persona. For someone who had maintained remarkable energy and health well into his 70s, the sudden deterioration was alarming. Medical professionals who treated him during this period were genuinely concerned about his survival. When Cliff finally started to re-emerge in public after 2018, people noticed. He changed. The openness that had characterized his entire career was gone, replaced by something more guarded, more careful. He wasn't doing extensive tours anymore. His media appearances were selective, controlled. This wasn't the Cliff Richard who'd been everywhere for decades. This was someone who learned a harsh lesson about how quickly trust can be betrayed and how thoroughly a reputation can be damaged regardless of truth. His approach to his career transformed completely. Instead of the constant activity that had defined his professional life, he became strategic. Fewer performances, but more meaningful ones. Carefully chosen projects rather than saying yes to everything. Quality over quantity. It wasn't retirement, but it wasn't the old Cliff either. It was something new, born from necessity and self-preservation. The experience also turned him into an advocate. Cliff started speaking publicly about privacy law reform, about how investigations should be conducted, about the damage that can be done when media and police collaborate to create public spectacles before any facts are established. His 2018 autobiography devoted significant space to the ordeal and its broader implications. What had been a private trauma became fuel for public advocacy, adding an unexpected dimension to his legacy. But there's another layer to his transformation that's less obvious but equally important. Cliff became intensely focused on legacy protection. When you spent 60 years building something and you watch it nearly crumble in an afternoon, you start thinking differently about how you'll be remembered. He got more involved in archival projects, remastering his catalog, curating retrospective collections. These weren't just commercial ventures. They were deliberate efforts to ensure his musical contributions would be properly contextualized for future generations. Every new project, every appearance, every interview became part of a larger strategy. How does this contribute to the complete picture of my life's work? It was a fundamentally different approach than the instinctive constant activity that had characterized most of his career. This was calculated, purposeful, protective. Hard-earned wisdom about how fragile public perception can be if you don't actively manage your own narrative. The industry took notice too. Cliff's case became a landmark example of media overreach and police mishandling of investigations. Changes in how such situations are managed can be traced directly back to his legal victory. Other public figures facing similar circumstances now have precedent to point to, protections that didn't exist before Cliff fought back. His ordeal, as devastating as it was personally, created systemic change that benefits others. But perhaps the most significant aspect of his disappearance and return is what it reveals about the cost of false accusations in the social media age. This wasn't just about one man suffering, though that alone was substantial. It was about the collision between traditional concepts of justice and modern media dynamics, about what happens when the presumption of innocence meets the demand for instant content and viral stories. about the human cost of getting that balance wrong. Today, Cliff Richard is still here, still performing occasionally, still engaged with his legacy. But he's not the same person who was raided in 2014. Nobody could be. He survived something that would have destroyed most people, came out the other side legally vindicated and financially compensated, but fundamentally changed. The eternal optimist became more cautious. The completely open public figure became more guarded. The constant presence became more selective. And maybe that's the real story. Not just what happened to him, but what it cost him beyond the legal fees and the health crisis and the lost opportunities. It cost him a piece of that innocence that had somehow survived 60 years in the entertainment industry. It cost him the ability to trust systems he believed in his entire life. It cost him years he can never get back, doing things he never should have had to do. The truth about why Cliff Richard vanished isn't just about a raid or an investigation or even a legal battle. It's about what happens when institutions fail someone so completely that they have to rebuild themselves from scratch. It's about discovering that 60 years of contributions can be overshadowed in an afternoon if you're not careful. And it's about the choice to come back anyway, on your own terms, with your eyes wide open about what the world can do when it turns against you, even temporarily, even wrongly. That's the legacy now. Not just the music, not just the 60 years of hits and performances and cultural impact, but also the caution, the advocacy, the hard-earned understanding that reputation is both more fragile and more important than he'd ever imagined. The Peter Pan of pop grew up not because he wanted to, but because he had to.